Hi there, my name's Katerina Lafidis, and this presentation is based on the topic, does exposure to media violence increase an individual's likelihood of engaging in violent behaviour? The article I've decided to discuss is called The Influence of Media Violence on Youth and comes from the Journal of Psychological Science in the Public Interest. Out of the 3 papers I explored, this one was the most relevant to the topic because it is a lot broader and discusses the issue using many studies as evidence. For this reason, the paper does not just cover one media, it covers multiple, both visual and interactive, and these studies all use similar methodologies and come to consistent conclusions. For more than 5 decades now, there has been a concern about the effect that violent mass media is having on youth. Due to this concern, many researchers conducted studies and wrote reports on the topic, including several professional groups and medical organisations, and even the government, who introduced the Telecommunications Act in 1966, which stated that TV sets had to be manufactured with the chip called a V-chip that permits parents to block violent content. This academic piece continues to discuss those concerns, exploring long and short-term effects that media violence has on youth, and focuses on comparing these past studies in depth. Unfortunately, there is not always a clear definition for violent media agreed upon by researchers. However, to compensate for that, this article comprises of a wide range of different studies that use similar methodologies, discuss a variety of medias, and come to consistent conclusions about violent media. The medias discussed include visual media such as dramatic television and movies, television news, music videos, and interactive media such as video games and the internet. The rationale of this paper was to critically discuss and evaluate a range of studies that deliberate over the effect of violent media on youth in both the short and the long term. It aims to find to what extent media violence increases the likelihood of aggressive and violent behaviour in adolescents, while giving a broad scope of the topic by referencing a wide range of studies and media forms with a variety of different methods, participants, and conclusions. This paper does not provide a hypothesis, but 5 research questions that it aims to observe. Number 1. What does research say about the relation, both long and short term, between media violence and aggressive and violent behaviour? Number 2. How does media violence produce its effects on aggressive and violent behaviour? Number 3. What characteristics of media violence are most influential and who is most susceptible to such influences? Number 4. How widespread and accessible is violence in the media, including TV, movies, music videos, video games, and internet? Number 5. How can individuals and society counteract the influence of media violence? The demographics of participants varied within each category of the study. However, as the focus of the paper is on youth, all the participants are within this category. This table represents the different participants used for the 2 categories of media. As you can see, for studies on visual media, participants were generally either young children or college students, and often male. But the exception to this was a longitudinal study for dramatic television and movies, as well as music videos, which had some female participants. For studies on interactive media, however, participants were much more diverse and included children, middle school students, high school students, college students, and were both female and male. There was a great amount of consistency in the methodology used for each study of the different mediums. In different ways, researchers would randomly expose youth to a form of violent media, or non-violent for comparison, and then assess how they interact with other people and how they behave in social environment after this exposure. For example, when conducting an experiment based on the responses to violent films, the researchers would expose some participants to a short, violent film and others to a non-violent film. They would then observe how they interact after this exposure. Depending on what type of experiment they were conducting and whether their study was based on long or short-term responses, they would ensure to examine the participants within a certain time frame. The nature of this paper brings a large research base and therefore a large variety of methods, samples, and media forms. It examines studies of both visual and interactive media using surveys and cross-sectional studies to observe the short-term effects of media violence on youth. Longitudinal studies are often used to examine serious physical aggression, as they generally provide better evidence about causal influences than cross-sectional studies. In addition to the discussion of the selected studies, meta-analysis are also described as they give an overall estimate of the effect size of a variable. The findings in this academic article are consistent across all methodologies, so it can be concluded that firstly, experimental research clearly demonstrates that exposure to media violence increases the probability that an adolescent will behave or think aggressively in the short run. Secondly, that cross-sectional surveys consistently show that the more frequently youth are exposed to media violence, the greater the chances of them behaving or thinking aggressively are. Third, that the longitudinal research demonstrates the relationship between exposure to media violence in childhood and consequent aggression in adolescence and young adulthood. In addition, it was also found that media violence has a modest direct effect on severe forms of violent behaviour. Furthermore, it was established that often the negative effects of recurring childhood exposure to media violence would extend into their adulthood, even if media violence is no longer being consumed, and that even individuals without aggressive tendencies are negatively affected by the exposure of violent media, both in short-term situations and over long periods of time. The theoretical explanations for the results of these studies are called social cognitive information processing models. These focus on how people perceive, think, learn, and therefore behave in their social world, both the real world through the interaction of people and the fictional world through the use of media. They explain how short-term consumption of violent media increases the likelihood of aggressive behaviour, both physical and verbal, aggressive thoughts and aggressive emotions by grooming existing aggressive scripts and perceptions, increasing physiological arousal and prompting the automatic tendency to imitate observed behaviours. It also supports evidence found in large-scale longitudinal studies that claim that long-term and frequent exposure to media violence is linked with the individuals having aggression later in their life. These effects come from several types of learning processes, which lead to the acquisition of lasting aggressive scripts, interpretational schemes, a warped idea of the acceptable level of aggression in the social environment, and a level of desensitization to violence. In the close of the academic piece, it is concluded that individuals react differently to media violence based on what are called moderators. These include viewers' characteristics such as age, gender, aggressiveness, intelligence, their perceptions of realism and identification with aggressive TV characters, viewers' social environment such as culture, neighbourhood and parents, and the characteristics of the media content itself, such as characteristics of the aggressive perpetrator and the justification and consequences of the aggression presented. The summary of strengths and weaknesses in the article are as follows. The strengths in the article is the fact that it provides an extensive range of studies to draw from, and these studies provide many examples of different mythologies, as well as covering a wide variety of media, both visual and interactive. Given that the studies reviewed were very similar in terms of conducting their experiments, this is a strength as it provides consistency and accuracy, whereas it can also be a weakness because it narrows the possibility of getting different outcomes. Another strength is that the article shows a lot of academic references and evidence, and this helps in making its conclusion, whereas as a weakness point of view, this is very one-sided, as the article does not consider the possibility of positive effects of media on youth. Another weakness is that the current research knowledge, including the studies in the actual article, aren't extensive enough, and that there is still a lot to be discovered about the relationship between media violence and violent behaviour in youth. The academic article discusses how the continuous advancement of technology will create more forms of media violence in the future, and that parents will be forced to find better tools to aid them in monitoring their children. It is also pointed out that changing the attitudes towards media violence, encouraging parental monitoring and guidance, and providing media education would be beneficial to society in helping to create a healthier media diet. The issue with this, however, could possibly be that it would be very difficult and quite costly. A few potential research questions I've come up with after reading this article is one, even though adults do not absorb influences like young children or young adults, how different is the relationship between media violence and aggressive behaviour in adults? And two, are there any beneficial aspects of controlled media violence, such as awareness or education?